But anyway, they all have big houses, so there's room for all of us.
Oh, good.
That's good. That's a good thing. Good evening to everyone out there in YouTube land. We have 3 people watching at the moment. Send a greeting. And Nick, why don't you start with paragraph 74, and then I'll read the long one, which is, I think it's 75, which is about the businessman. And I happen to have some experience there. So go ahead with 74, though. Let's talk about that.
All right, you got it. So let's see here. 74. What is true of humanity in general is also true of each individual, for humanity consists only of individuals. And as is the psychology of humanity, so also the psychology of the individual. The World War brought a terrible reckoning with the rational intentions of civilization. What is called will in the individual is called imperialism in nations, for all will is a demonstration of power over fate, i.e., the exclusion of chance. Civilization is the rational, purposeful sublimation of free energies brought about by will and intention. It is the same with the individual. And just as the idea of a world civilization received a fearful correction at the hands of war, so the individual must often learn in his life that so-called disposable energies are not his to dispose.
Okay, what do you think that means? All of that means.
Let's see. I'm trying to kind of establish some context, even just for myself here, about where we left off last week. I haven't given much thought to this since we read on it last week. Let me see.
Well,
when he uses this term imperialism, it's very loaded, you know, these days, maybe not especially these days, but in terms of notions of empire, notions of one nation having power over another nation.
Right.
From the viewpoint of right now in the 21st century, a lot of people are saying this is very negative.
Well, yeah.
Although there isn't the notion of sort of socialized medicine or, you know, communal decision making or any of these alternative routes to shared power that are particularly popular, I don't think, I hate to use the word opposition, but in contrast.
Yeah, the people that are selling will come from the Nietzsche side, I think, and certainly they did at the time of World War I and the time of Hitler and so on. But you know, the truth is that even though the GOP rails against socialism, we actually have quite a bit of socialism in this country, and we have it because it makes sense. And particularly, I think of the fire departments of colonial America, because I live in a colonial city. And for example, the Catholic Church, which is right down among them in Annapolis, and which is really a beautiful church built in 1856, but it's actually the third iteration. The previous 2 versions of this church burned down, and of course we lit and heated our homes with fire. We still do, but it's sublimated into electricity for the most part. But in colonial America, people couldn't read at night unless they had a candle or something, or a hurricane lamp or whatever it was. And so individuals got together and they said, oh, well, let's create a fire brigade, and then we'll sell insurance to our fire brigade. And what happened was that all these entrepreneurs got the idea that they would each have a fire company, and they created something called fire marks, which they're a plaque about this big, let's say, and the plaque was made out of iron, and it had the symbol of the fire company on it. And if you paid the insurance, they would give you this plaque and you would put it on your house. And so if your house started to burn, all the fire companies would respond, but only the one that you paid would fight the fire. And that was pretty inefficient, and a lot of homes burned. Today we have those plaques, but they are restricted to the historic Annapolis Foundation. And the old fire marks are really collector's items today. But we have socialized fire defense now. Even in volunteer companies, it's a collective effort. They'll come out and fight everybody's fire now. They don't discriminate whether you paid or not, because they're getting something. They're getting paid something out of it, and the community is, giving them a truck to play with and all that sort of stuff. But we have lots of things. Our police are socialized. Our armed forces are socialized, and many other things. A lot, Medicare is certainly socialized, and Medicaid. And so we do have a lot of socialist approaches to problems, which makes a lot of sense. Nobody argues with it. Not the most devout right-wing Republican would claim that we shouldn't have a socialized fire department today. I don't think, anyway. I haven't heard anybody complaining about it, or the police department. So anyway,
I want to add here, I just read the paragraph coming before this 173, and it kind of helped me to establish some context. But I realized, picking up where we left off, that he's kind of making a case that fate is not solely rational.
right.
There's so much planning and so much intention that can go into coming up with a society and organizing things and having intentions for the future. And inevitably the pendulum swings, and not all things are rational.
Yeah. And just my favorite paragraph in all of Jungian psychology is in Man and His Symbols. And it's on page 101 of the hardbound version. It's the second last full paragraph on page 101. And I'll just read it to you because it relates to the role of the individual. As any change must begin somewhere, it is the single individual who will experience it and carry it through. The change must indeed begin with an individual. It might be any one of us. Nobody can afford to look around and to wait for somebody else to do what he is loath to do himself. But since nobody seems to know what to do, it might be worthwhile for each of us to ask himself whether by any chance his or her unconscious may know something that will help us. Certainly the unconscious mind seems unable to do anything useful in this respect, or certainly the conscious mind seems unable to do anything useful in this respect. Man today is painfully aware of the fact that neither his great religions nor his various philosophies seem to provide him with those powerful animating ideas that would give him the security he needs in the face of the present condition of the world. And he wrote that in the mid 1950s, and nothing has changed. Nothing has gotten better. And so, part of the reason, good evening, Raquel, nice to see you. And I hope you got the access to the Dropbox that I was sending you, Raquel, but I don't know, things got blurred last week, so let me know if I need to send it to you. Anyway.
Hi, Raquel.
Yeah, hi, Raquel.
That's been a long time.
Yeah, she was here last week. I'm glad to see her. But the point is that, I was railing against the Jungian analyst community for many years because I said, why don't you talk about this in current affairs so that people in the general public can understand these things a little more? And what I started to realize was that, for them, it's really a busman's holiday, the busman who drives the bus and then on his holiday goes for a ride on the bus. And and so the point is that, if you're going to be in somebody's psyche 7 or 8 hours a day as a Jungian analyst, it's not very appealing to then go out and also do it for the collective. And so I started to appreciate that and started to realize that if anybody was going to do something, it was me. And so that's why I started doing this actually 6 years ago, going on 6 years ago now. So we have to move things forward. And, when I first started, I thought I might get complaints from the Jungian analyst community, but really I never have gotten any. And, but I've gotten a lot of sort of attaboys and you're doing a good thing, Skip, I'm glad you're doing it type stuff. Glad it's not me that's doing it, basically is what they're saying. But anyway, so that's one thing to watch out for, Nick, because you're either going to do it with individuals in a practice, but if you're doing it in a practice, you're probably not going to make a big dent on the collective. And my view is, and the reason I do this and leave these videos online is because that's the only way the collective gets to hear about this stuff, basically. If you're doing it 8 hours a day, who wants to do it in the evening?
I don't know. I want to say, I think that there's kind of a contradiction in terms there, because if we just take this paragraph right here, 74, what he's saying is that what's true of the individual is also true of the collective, but also vice versa. What's true of the collective is also true for the individual.
Yes.
So doing work at the individual level is also making a contribution to the collective. And he is very careful at several points in his thought to not drive the wedge between subject and object, individual, collective, and all of that kind of thing.
Right. My only criticism of that is, you can only handle so many clients, and they're not that many Jungian analysts. I mean, in the Washington area, there are only 12, and 10 of them are women who are over 70.
Yeah.
And so
that's true for pretty much everywhere.
Right. And we desperately need more, and we need more men doing it. Okay. And, I've thought for many years that if I had an analyst, I would want a woman, so I would get the counterpoint, of the feminine perspective. But I'm not so sure. I don't know. But what happens? James Hollis talked to me about this one time, and he's now in practice in Washington. he used to be the president of the Jung Society of Washington. And he said that he's written many books, of course. And he said that there was only him and one other man doing Jungian analysis in Washington. And he said the other guy works mainly with gay patients, mostly people who are gay and are trying to deal with their gayness, I guess. And so that means that it's only Jim to support all the rest of the male community in the Washington area, unless they want to go to the 10 women. So it's a big question. What would you
I think
want
you also run an interesting issue too, and this is something that I don't think is unique to the Jungian community, but just in general, of then, you would essentially be proselytizing or trying to evangelize other people if they don't come to it, but you try to present whatever that thing is to them. And I know that that's, been a personal issue that I've had to work out in my own life. And like I said, it's not only in regards to finding something very meaningful in Jungian thought, but for just anything that I found to be meaningful, of course, you want to share that with people. But there's this weird thing that happens when you want to share something with somebody and they don't either care for it or they're not ready for it, or whatever variable causes it to be a point of disinterest for them. And I think that that's also an issue with the kind of trying to take Jungian psychology to the quote collective. I mean,
I came up against that issue, of course, because as I complain about my Pennsylvania Dutch ancestors who don't like to use buttons, for example, only hooks and eyes. Meanwhile, I have a uniform that's got 13 gold buttons and a red sash. but anyway, these Pennsylvania Dutch ancestors are in my psyche only. I don't know that I've ever met one in point of fact, because they were my great-grandfather on my mother's side. But I am leery about becoming prideful. I don't want to become prideful. And, I finally got to the point where I decided I don't want to, make it a big deal whether people pay me anything for what I do or not. I mean, I invite them, and for the advanced reading group, I invite people to pay $10 a month, which is basically nothing, but only about a quarter of the people there actually do it. and I don't make it an issue because I think the collective needs to know these things, be aware of them. And so, I've just taken upon myself to put them out in a medium that they can know them. And that's why I'm doing the play and doing the conference next summer, which at least neither Tim nor I are going to take anything out of the confluence. We've committed to that. And I think pretty much everybody that's in the organizing group has committed to that.
Yeah, and in spite of what I said, I would like to be counted among the crowd of people who are thankful for your contribution. So,
well, yes, I appreciate that, and I presume that people who are willing to be here are grateful for it. And as Margaret Mead said one time, she said, you can't imagine that a small group can't get anything done, because in the end, it's the only thing that ever has gotten anything done is a small group of people working together. And so I think that always keeps me going. Justin says, only met one psychoanalyst in Denmark, a male German, probably there are more, but I bet they are rare, maybe. And so, all right, well, let me read on with this next paragraph because it's about 2 pages long and I've sort of lived it. So I'll read it and then you guys can talk about it. Once in America, I was consulted by a businessman of about 45, whose case is a good illustration of what has been said. He was a typical American self-made man who had worked his way up from the bottom. He had been very successful and had founded an immense business. He had also succeeded in organizing it in such a way that he was able to think of retiring. 2 years before I saw him, he had in fact taken this farewell. Until then, he had lived entirely for his business and concentrated all of his energies on it with the incredible intensity and one-sidedness peculiar to successful American businessmen. He had purchased a splendid estate where he thought of living, by which he meant horses, automobiles, golf, tennis, parties, and whatnot. But he had reckoned without his host. The energy which should have been at his disposal would not enter into these alluring prospects, but went capering off in quite another direction. A few weeks after the initiation of the longed for life of bliss, he began brooding over peculiar, vague sensations in his body, and a few weeks more sufficed to plunge him into a state of extreme hypochondria. He had a complete nervous collapse. From a healthy man of uncommon physical strength and abounding energy, he became a peevish child. That was the end of all his glories. He fell from one state of anxiety to the next and worried himself almost to death with hypochondriacal mopings. He then consulted a famous specialist who recognized at once that there was nothing wrong with the man but a lack of work. The patient saw the sense of this and returned to his former position. But to his immense disappointment, no interest in the business could be aroused. Neither patience nor resolution was of any use. His energy could not be by any means be forced back into the business. His condition naturally became worse than before. All that had formerly been living, creative energy in him now turned against him with terrible destroying force. His creative genius rose up, as it were, in revolt against him. And just as before, he had built up great organizations in the world, so now his demon spun equally subtle systems of hypochondriacal delusion that completely annihilated him. When I saw him, he was already a hopeless moral ruin. Nevertheless, I tried to make clear to him that though such colossal energy might be withdrawn from the business, the question remained, where should it go? The finest horses, the fastest cars, and the most amusing parties may very likely fail to allure the energy, although it would be rational enough to think that a man who had devoted his whole life to serious work had a sort of natural right to enjoy himself. Yes, if fate behaved in a humanly rational way, it would certainly be so. First work, then well-earned rest. But fate behaves irrationally, and the energy of life inconveniently demands a gradient agreeable to itself. Otherwise, it simply gets dammed up and turned destructive. It regresses to former situations. In the case of this man, to the memory of a syphilitic infection contracted 25 years before. Yet even this was only a stage on the way to the resuscitation of infantile reminiscences, which had all but vanished in the meantime. It was the original relation to his mother that mapped the course of his symptoms. They were an arrangement whose purpose it was to compel the attention and interest of his long dead mother. Nor was this stage the last, for this ultimate goal was to drive him back, as it were, into his own body after he had lived since his youth only in his head. He had differentiated one side of his being, the other side remained in inert physical state. He would have needed his other side in order to live. The hypochondriacal depression pushed him down into the body he had always overlooked. Had he been able to follow the direction indicated by his depression and hypochondriacal illusion, and made himself conscious of the fantasies which proceed from such a condition, that would have been the road to salvation. My arguments naturally met with no response, as was to be expected. A case so far advanced only be cared for until death. It can hardly be cured. I guess I'll read one more paragraph. This example clearly shows that it does not lie in our power to transfer disposable energy at will to a rationally chosen object. The same is true in general of the apparently disposable energy, which disengage when we have destroyed its unserviceable forms through the corrosive of reductive analysis. The energy, as we have said, can at best be applied voluntarily for only a short time, but in most cases it refuses to seize hold for any length of time of the possibilities rationally presented to it. Psychic energy is a very fastidious thing, which insists on fulfillment of its own conditions. However, much energy may be present. We cannot make it serviceable until we have succeeded in finding the right gradient. And so that is sort of definitely applicable to me, because after each of my successful business forays in Japan and India and Saudi Arabia, I can't even imagine going back to those in the same way now. It just has no interest to me. And, what I have found is that, Jung's work is what gives me energy, new energy. And the point of our confluence is to help people see how creation, the act of creation through various kinds of art, does generate new energy, okay, which it has done for me as we've been planning it for the last several months, 5 months now, and we will be planning it for the rest of the year until next June. And I find I do have the energy for it. I have the energy to perform as an actor in a play as Carl Jung, which is why I'm throwing this thing. So, I'm pushed along. I'm given energy by those things. I don't necessarily know why, but I do know that it's the gradient that keeps me going. So, other comments?
Yeah, it's really fascinating here at the end. I mean, in the middle of, well, I say the middle, really the top of page 52 in this extremely long paragraph.
Yeah.
It's fascinating, firstly, that he's talking about this as if the man has reached a point in his life where he has to begin working on his sensation function. Saying, he was pressed down into his body.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see here. He would have needed this other side in order to live. The hypochondriacal depression pushed him into the body he had always overlooked. Yeah, so that's a pretty critical turning point in the man's life. Follows that by saying, had he been able to follow the direction indicated by his depression and hypochondriacal illusion, and make himself conscious of the fantasies which proceed from such a condition, that would have been the road to salvation.
Yeah.
And it's really interesting. I mean, it's almost as if he's saying, just working on your inner images, whether they be fantasies or dreams, would have helped to engage in the process of moving that libido up, instead of remaining below the threshold in a corrosive fashion.
Yeah, and you obviously have the drive now because you're driven to these things that we've been discussing for the last couple of years, and I thought it was quite impressive last couple weeks ago when Marilyn, who's a lifelong psychotherapist, said to you she thought you were a professor. Which you certainly are, much more knowledgeable than most of them. But Beth, do you have any comments on this? Have you seen energy drawn away from people and that sort of thing?
Well, I just had something that came up when I was reading. It's probably more of a question, but maybe a comment. I'm not sure. Yeah. I feel like it's for just my having no understanding of this. It feels like a cautionary tale, but I don't really get what and maybe you can help me with this. But but he had reckoned without his host being like his shadow side, or like it's
no,
like
his self. And not only his shadow, but his whole self, both.
So kind of saying like if he had put some work into it before he made that decision.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think I can speak for Nick, and I certainly feel that I recognize myself when it's telling me to do something, and I follow that direction. Okay, and so interestingly, in this play, which you can find online because the Asheville Jung Center published it, so the 2016 performance of the play called "The Analyst and the Rabbi," you can find performed by Europeans, but in English. And, one of the things that Jung says early on is he had to go see Rabbi Beck. He had some dreams that told him he had to do so, and he had no choice because he recognized that. He recognized the direction of his dream as something that he had to do. So in the play, he's talking about the fact that this disembodied voice is saying ex cathedra, Beck, go see Beck. And it was a solution to one of his problems. In fact, it was all of his problems because it turns out that this part that I'm playing is actually dealing with all of the shadow elements of Jung's psyche, not only his womanizing, but also his early sort of not support per se, but his early sort of fascination with the Nazi development in Germany, which is undeniable, and which the rabbi is criticizing him for after the war. And that came up in this group on the fourth session when we were I was only meeting with local people at the time, and 5 of them were psychotherapists, but one of them came in and said, well, what about Jung being a Nazi and doing these bad things? And so I had to get into it, and I learned what had happened to him, and he sort of by happenstance got sucked into being supportive of the psychotherapy community in Germany, because some of his colleagues, including his Jewish colleagues, begged him to take the role. And so he did. He put his name on the annual report of it and so on. And unfortunately, he wrote a very negative article about Jewish psychology, which was, he can never live down. And so what we're doing by performing the play is we're airing his dirty laundry, actually. And so in a sense, for me, it's a difficult role to play, because I studied up on what his role was, and I came to the conclusion that he was caught in happenstance and he got out of it as quickly as he could. The unfortunate thing was that when he left being the president of the German psychotherapeutic organization that he was the president of, the man who took it over was Martin Goering, who was Hermann Goering's brother. And of course, Hermann Goering had been the propagandist for Hitler, or not the propagandist, but the sort of the chief of staff to Hitler. And so it was his brother that became the president then. And so there was a bad turn in German psychotherapy at that point. And of course, they burned Freud's books and so on. So, those things are out there. We get caught up in them, and the reason we're performing the play is I believe it's a metaphor for what's happening in the U.S. now. And we need to pay attention to the same issues. So I'm not sure I answered your question. I got sort of on a
Skip, I'm glad that you went in that direction with your answer, because it sort of winds back to what we were talking about the previous paragraph, where there's a zeitgeist at any given time.
Sure.
Me being what you might call a child of the 60s, but only because
Me too.
yeah, but because I experienced as a, old enough person, things that right now, 2021, people see as sort of myth and pieces of movies, and not quite getting how much of a reality it was, and also how much there seemed to be a dream of something. Ecology, shared responsibilities, intentional communities, all this kind of things. But then what we have now is this incredible amount of violence.
Yeah.
Not that there wasn't an incredible amount of violence going on them. I mean, I'll never forget, the pepper spray and buses pushed over by police onto friends of mine in Washington, D.C., the kinds of things that we experienced that were kind of like, this could never happen again. And then here we are now, this zeitgeist. I mean, just to grab kind of dumb generalized word for it, but we find ourselves in a angry and like that word segregation, there used to be one kind of thing.
Mhm.
Now it's a segregated world in many
Many
ways.
ways, yeah, sure. Yeah, no doubt. And it was ugly then, and it's ugly now.
Right.
And
But there was beauty then, and there's beauty. You know that we're going to get together and we're going to do something about this. You know, there's
well,
a board that I'm on, and there was a training, right, about how to, you know, sort of be more inclusive. And then I
that,
work in a corporate job. We get these trainings that are about how to talk to people so that they don't feel other, or that honors and respects them.
yeah,
It's interesting, you know?
yeah. Well, I have a certain perspective on the 60s.
Mm,
I do think that, a lot of it got launched by Jung,
mhm,
as is evidenced by the fact that he's on the cover of the Beatles album Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, as
mhm,
is Freud. And so the Beatles and a lot of young philosophers and songwriters, got it, what the new age would become, the age of Aquarius. And of course, there was the stage show Hair, which was quite impressive to me when I saw it at the National Theater.
mhm.
And this beautiful naked woman walks up the arms of the chairs right over me. I go, wow, never thought I'd see that. And but my perspective is that it was an immature age of Aquarius, because people didn't know what they were doing. I didn't know what I was doing by joining the Marine Corps, and the people that were protesting didn't know what they were doing either. And my best friend in the world happens to be a man who, in our junior year of college, he went to Canada. He never came back, and he still lives on the east coast of Vancouver Island, and very happily. And we're still very good friends. We've been friends since 1962, and he's actually my dearest friend in life. And he did the opposite thing from me, and I didn't agree with him then, but in the fullness of time, I have to agree that his position was the correct one, and that I, as a Marine Corps officer, actually became a tool of the President of the United States, and I didn't I didn't really consider what I was doing in the terms of, the collective and the future of the world, that sort of thing. It was just the family business as far as I was concerned, because I was raised in the Navy. And, but now I think we're in a position to have the dawning of the age of Aquarius in a much more mature way. In other words, instead of going to Woodstock and ripping our clothes off and having a great drunk for a weekend and listening to a lot of loud music, we're actually looking for ways to actually change the world. And that's what I'm doing here. That's why I'm here, because I think people dispute when the age of Aquarius begins, between about 1960, when it started, the immature age of Aquarius began, to about 2040. But I'm putting a stake in the ground, and I'm saying it's happening now. We're ready to receive the wisdom of Sophia and move into a new stage of consciousness, which is what Jung posited, and which Mary Stein posits in his book, Map of the Soul. We're mature enough to go into that new stage of consciousness that we certainly weren't in the 60s, and that ultimately got deep sixed by our parents, I guess. And I was sort of oblivious to that because I was in the beginnings of my career trying to become a lawyer, trying to become an MBA, going to being a Marine and a reserve Marine and all that stuff. So I was so busy starting a family and all those things that all required responsibility, of course, that, I never really followed what was happening in the zeitgeist at that time. I was just dead set on making a successful career, which I did in many ways. But I remember one day I was basically doing 4 jobs. I was practicing law full time by myself. I was going to school full time for my MBA. I was teaching 2 courses for Nazareth College of Rochester. So I was teaching at the college level, sort of 2/3 time. And I was the company commander of the reserve unit of the local reserve unit in Rochester, which is H&S Company 8th Tank Battalion. And one day I was driving out of the reserve center and I turned right, and then I just had a mind freeze. I just didn't know where I was going or what I was doing. And I literally didn't know how to drive anymore. And fortunately, I pulled my car over onto the shoulder and just closed my eyes, and I went to sleep for about maybe 10 minutes. And in that 10-minute time, my mind reset. But I was pushing the envelope, definitely. And I had this definite reset, and and shortly after that, I got assigned to a job in Japan. So, gosh, what a world.
All right, can somebody take on 77?
Yeah, that's a good idea. Beth, you want to read 77?
Sure. This question of the gradient is an eminently practical problem which crops up in most analyses. For instance, when in a favorable case, the disposable energy, the so-called libido, the footnote says, from the foregoing, it will have become clear to the reader that the term libido, coined by Freud and very suitable for practical usage, is used by me in a much wider sense. Libido for me means psychic energy, which is equivalent. Oh, do you want me to read all of that footnote?
It's not a bad idea.
Okay. Which is equivalent to the intensity with which psychic contents are charged. Freud, in accordance with his theoretical assumptions, identifies libido with eros and tries to distinguish it from psychic energy in general. Thus, he says, in 3 essays on the theory of sexuality, we have defined the concept of libido as a quantitatively variable force which would serve as a measure of processes and transformations occurring in the field of sexual excitation. We distinguish this libido in respect of its special origin from the energy which must be supposed to underlie mental processes in general. Elsewhere, Freud remarks that in respect of the destructive instinct, he lacks, quote, a term analogous to libido, end of quote. Since the so-called destructive instinct is also a phenomenon of energy, it seems to me simpler to define libido as an inclusive term for psychic intensities and consequently as sheer psychic energy by symbols of transformation.
Right.
So, the so-called libido does seize hold of a rational object we think we have brought about the transformation through conscious exertion of the will. But in that we are deluded, because even the most strenuous exertions would not have sufficed had there not been present at the same time a gradient in that direction. How important the gradient is can be seen in cases when, despite the most desperate exertions and despite the fact that the object chosen or the form desired impresses everybody with its reasonableness, the transformation still refuses to take place, and all that happens is a new repression.
Right. Now, so the distinction here that's very critical is that Freud defined libido as sexual and mainly as sexual only, whereas Jung said there was much more to it. And so I want to draw everyone's attention to this book, which is called Psychic Energy. And it's, it's the source and its transformation by Esther Harding, Psychic Energy. And it was published in 1949. Now, Esther Harding was a first generation Jungian. She and a couple of other women from the United States made regular trips to Europe during the 20s and 30s and became the early progenitors of Jungian theory. And Esther Harding, with Edward Edinger, founded the Jung Institute in New York City. That's one of the things that one of their claims to fame. And she also wrote a terrific book called The Way of All Women. But this book, Psychic Energy, is a terrific book. And if you can find it even in a used place, I think it may be back in print because I've been promoting it over a long period of time. And so I just want to read just the first page of it, which is in the introduction, just to give you a sense of what she says. And first of all, there's a little quote before the paragraph actually begins, which says, "The form that swim and the shapes that creep under the waters of sleep." And then here's what she says. "Beneath the decent facade of consciousness, with its disciplined moral order, and its good intentions, lurk the crude, instinctive forces of life, like monsters of the deep, devouring, begetting, warring endlessly. They are, for the most part, unseen, yet on their urge and energy, life itself depends. Without them, living beings would be as inert as stones. But were they left to function unchecked, life would lose its meaning, being reduced once more to mere birth and death, as in the teeming world of the primordial swamps. In creating civilization, man sought, however unconsciously, to curb these natural forces and to channel some part, at least, of their energy into forms that would serve a different purpose. For with the coming of consciousness, cultural and psychological values began to compete with the purely biological aims of the unconscious functioning. Throughout history, two factors have been at work in the struggle to bring about the control and discipline of these non-personal instinctive forces of the psyche. Social controls and the demands of material necessity have exerted a powerful discipline from without, while an influence of perhaps even greater potency has been applied from within the individual himself in the form of symbols and experiences of a numinous character, psychological experiences that have had a powerful influence on certain individuals in every community. So powerful, indeed, were these experiences that they became the core of religious dogmas and rituals that in turn have influenced the large mass of the people. That these religions religious forms have had power to curb the violence and ruthlessness of the primitive instincts to such an extent, and for so long a time, is a matter of the greatest wonder and amazement. It must mean that the symbols of a particular religion were peculiarly adapted to satisfy the urge of the conflicting inner forces, even lacking the aid of conscious understanding, and in many cases without the individual's having himself participated in the numinous experience on which the ritual was originally based. Okay, I'm going to stop there, but that's the first two paragraphs of this book. And as you can tell, I put a few tabs in it, in addition to a few underlinings and so on. So I think it's a very important book. And if you have not read it, I urge you to read it. It's called Psychic Energy. And I always keep it within arm's reach as I'm reading. So
I think if we kind of bring back the question that Beth asked about he had not reckoned with his host, I think there's something in there about Jung is saying that, had he been aware of the unconscious and everything that's kind of lurking beneath the surface, perhaps he could have harmonized his conscious intention with whatever was brewing in the unconscious, but instead he kind of moved against the grain in that regard, and ultimately it was to his disadvantage.
Yeah, I agree entirely. So, Annabelle, do you want to read paragraph 78?
I had one other question though. Like,
Sure.
the question of the gradient, like what does he mean by gradient?
Well, he means a gradient. You have a gradient on big hills where the big trucks have to have an escape exit, where if they lose their brakes and they can't stop coming down these long mountains, then they can go off on this side road, and it's actually made of deep gravel, and it just forces them to slow down. That's a gradient. That's what a gradient is like. And so,
what does that mean in, like, as far as,
well, it means in the
like
psyche, some things are super highways, and some things are gravel roads, and some things are dirt roads, and some things are macadam roads. And
so it's kind of like how your unconscious wants you to flow.
yeah,
I think
what's
that's
the easy
fairly
way.
close. Yeah, I think that's fairly close, Beth. I think that's a term that's always kind of thrown me for a loop a bit as well, but I think it has to do, I think it's expresses this notion of finding a suitable expression for the energy that's in the unconscious, a suitable object,
Energy,
something
okay.
for that energy to flow towards.
Right.
Thank you.
And it can be sex, as I recall. Didn't mean to refer to you as sex, but but anyway, as Freud pointed out, it could be sex, and you have energy for that. And as Edinger said, Mother Nature is imperious, and this is what he was talking about. But you can also have energy for painting a religious painting, or doing a religious sculpture, or doing a modern dance. And the energy can flow in that way as well. Those are gradients as well. And so it doesn't have to be sexual. Okay, and this is what Jung's observation was throughout his career, that Freud had gotten a little bit one-sided, and in the Dangerous Method, Otto what's his name, Otto Gross in the Dangerous Method says, well, Freud is on about sex because he isn't getting any. There's a certain amount of that. And so, you have to decide where the energy is going to go. And Otto Gross was actually trying to do psychotherapy at one point, was counseling a woman, and he said, well, you can either choose to use your energy by being my lover, or you can commit suicide, one of the two. And then he says she chose both. And so, you have to be careful where your guides are leading you, where the spirits are leading you. And this is why Jung always repeated 1 John 4:1, which is consider the spirits, whether they be of God or not, and decide what is it that you think should be brought into the world and what not. So carry on. So do you want to go on, Annabelle, or did I attend to your issue, Beth? Sort of. Not so convincingly, but
I was on mute. Now that we've brought up Faust and the Sympathy for the Devil by the Rolling Stones, which is the contrast to the Freud and Jung on the cover of the Beatles. So 79, right? No, wait, that's 78 or 79? 78. Yeah, 78 is where I am. It has become abundantly clear to me that life can flow forward only along the path of the gradient. But there is no energy unless there is a tension of opposites. Hence, it is necessary to discover the opposite to the attitude of the conscious mind. It is interesting to see how this compensation by opposites also plays its part in the historical theories of neurosis. Freud's theory espoused eros, Adler's the will to power. Logically, the opposite of love is hate, and of eros, phobos, fear. But psychologically, it is the will to power. Where love reigns, there is no will to power. But where the will to power is paramount, love is lacking. The one is but the shadow of the other. The man who adopts the standpoint of eros finds his compensatory opposite in the will to power, and that of the man who puts the accent on power is eros. Seen from the one-sided point of view of the conscious attitude, the shadow is an inferior component of the personality and is consequently repressed through intensive resistance. But the repressed content must be made conscious so as to produce a tension of opposites, without which no forward movement is possible. The conscious mind is on top, the shadow underneath, and just as high always longs for low and hot for cold, so all consciousness, perhaps without being aware of it, seeks its unconscious opposite, lacking which it is doomed to stagnation, congestion, and ossification. Life is born only of the spark of opposites.
okay, was that clear enough? Are you good with that one, Beth? Yeah. How about you, Raquel? You're happy?
Yeah, I'm good. I'm just observing today.
Okay, we won't press you much.
So good to hear you and see you.
Yes,
Thank
definitely.
you.
Are you
It's good to be
healthy?
back.
Have you been healthy?
Yeah.
Very good.
Wonderful.
We're, the way that I can, I'm healthy.
Very
I'm healthy
good. Very good.
So Nick, you want to comment and or read the next paragraph?
Yeah, I'll read the next one. I had to step out of the room for a second, so I didn't hear all of that. So 79. Let's see here. It was a concession to intellectual logic on the one hand and to psychological prejudice on the other that impelled Freud to name the opposite of eros the destructive or death instinct. For in the first place, eros is not equivalent to life, but for anyone who thinks it is, the opposite of eros will naturally appear to be death. And in the second place, we all feel that that the opposite of our own highest principle must be purely destructive, deadly, and evil. We refuse to endow it with any positive life force, hence we avoid and fear it.
Well, that's surely true. I'll give you the example of my life in 2008, because a lot of people were seeing crashes of their businesses. I had a neighbor who had basically the most successful nursery business in my region. And if you went over to his nursery on Saturday and Sunday, the parking lot would be completely crammed, and it parks several hundred cars. And and he had a beautiful home on, right off the Chesapeake Bay, but on water that led out to the Chesapeake Bay. And I had a very nice home at the time. And, the pressure on both of us as businessmen was our psyche was throwing up this suicidal ideation. And every time it came up for me, I would say, perish that thought. I don't want to, I'm not going to commit suicide. I want to see how this movie comes out. And so I just said, perish the thought. I will not do that. But he did. Okay. And so he went out in the middle of his little lake in a rowboat one fine day and blew his brains out, leaving his wife and a couple of kids. And whatever had happened to his nursery, it's still thriving. It still has the same name. So I don't know what actually happened from a financial point of view from his nursery, but he wasn't there to see how the movie came out. And so, there are these devilish energies that come up, and you have to recognize them for what they are. And certainly suicidal ideation is dangerous, as any psychotherapist will tell you. And what it means is the idea of suicide comes into your mind. And, I'm not a psychotherapist, so my advice is based on personal experience only, but I would say, perish that thought. Don't entertain that thought, because our society and our systems do have ways to pull people out of the doldrums, and they do in all aspects of our society, whether it's among the poor or among the nouveau riche. Everybody has systems that will pull them out. We have very little, at least in the Western world, we have very little abject poverty that leads to starvation. I mean, we see it in Somalia and Sudan, perhaps, but it's pretty rare to see somebody actually starve to death in the United States. Somehow people have their assets, and I don't mean by that money. I mean they have family or churches or somebody that pulls them through. So that's my homily, but anybody's entitled to comment.
I could talk a little about 2008. I don't remember if I've spoken about it here. I must have.
Well, you're
The
welcome
short
to.
story is that I lost my home and spent 5 years essentially homeless, but I always had a place to sleep. I always had friends. I always had family. I always had something. But I'm particularly kind of moved to mention it now because I was at this wedding in California. Saw many
Mhm.
people whom I haven't seen in a very long time. And I saw some people who don't know me very well, but we are acquaintances and linked.
Mhm.
And one of those people asked me about my father, my daughter's father.
Mhm.
I was about to flip those, my father's daughter. So I guess we know where I was going with that. But they asked about my daughter's father. So of course I talked about my father's daughter, which is me. But I just explained a few things, like very, what to me was very lightly touching the surface, right?
Right.
And I'll do a quick version. This isn't much longer than what I did there sitting on this sofa in this hotel. We got married. My daughter was born. When she was 4 and a little over 4 years old, he left. And I had supported him for the previous 4.5 years. And he never contributed financially after that. And I learned 6 years later that he had been in a relationship with another woman for a full year before he left me. And I had kept all of my inheritance, which wasn't loads of money, but my inheritance, in the house I bought where my daughter spent the first 14 years of her life. And then all that money doubled. I moved to my second house in 2003. We lived there for 5 years. My daughter graduated high school. And I lost it all.
Mhm.
And I was told, why do you sound so bitter? And I told it. I told just that many, surface of the lake, very still water kind of facts. And I said, did that sound bitter? You were listening, I was speaking, so you're better authority. But it wasn't the person I was speaking to, it was a person sitting on the side, right?
Yeah.
So anyway, that's all I have to say. Because there's a lot I don't get about the world, and I'm fine. I had already, during the struggling years of raising my daughter, had the most wonderful, support and guidance, much of it just kind of verbal. And I was frequently reminded, do you have food in your refrigerator? Do you have light? I mean, sometimes our electricity was turned off, but I had flashlights and I had candles and matches.
Mhm.
Do you have light, shelter, the basics of food,
Right.
of life, the food of life. And is your daughter healthy, and are you healthy, and is everything okay?
Yeah.
I always had to say yes.
And that's the way it was for me as well. I mean,
Right.
I had a house that at one point was valued at $1.2 million,
Right.
and the crash destroyed its value.
Right.
And ultimately, after a year and a half of paying my mortgage out of my savings, and I got to the point where I couldn't do that anymore, and so they started a foreclosure action on the house in
Right.
2010, and I kept that going
Right.
in fine Trumpian style until 2019. So I fought that lawsuit for 9 years. I took it to the Court of Appeals of Maryland 5 times. I took it to the Supreme Court of the United States once, and by the time we finally sort of abandoned the process, I could have kept it going for another year or two, but I decided not to, because we'd moved out 18 months before,
Right.
and we're living where we're living now. And so I was still going over there and mowing the lawn and keeping the house up. But, I started to get what I would call improper things happening around the house from my opponents. And, I thought about for a long time, making a big stinko about it. I actually filed over 4,000 pages of documents in the 9 years. But the court sealed it because they knew I was right, but they couldn't allow others to get the idea. Okay, because basically what I did is what former President Trump is doing now, which is rope-a-dope. And if I, in the fullness of time, I have to look back with wisdom and say, well, that's the way the system works, and I was never going to win that case, even though I was right. and so I decided to move on. But anyway, in that time, that 9-year period, Deb and I stayed in the house, or most of it, 7.5 years, we stayed in the house. Didn't pay any mortgage in that 7.5 years. So my work on the lawsuit was basically my rent.
Right.
And I was able to keep a beautiful home over our head for all that time, and it worked out. And so we got to the point where we felt we could move, and we did. And you can't beat City Hall in the end, but
Right.
it doesn't mean that I approve of the way our financial system operates, but that's a different story. So anyway, Nick, go on. Let's go on.
Okay. So starting with 80 here, this is quite a long paragraph, so bear with me. As I have already indicated, there are many highest principles, both of life and of philosophy, and accordingly, there are just as many different forms of compensation by opposites. Earlier on, I singled out the two, as it seems to me, main opposite types, which I have called introverted and extroverted. William James, he has a footnote here to William James' work called Pragmatism, or his notion of pragmatism, had already been struck by the existence of both these types among thinkers. He distinguished them as the tender-minded and tough-minded. Similarly, Oswald found an analogous division into classic and romantic types among men of learning. So I am not alone in my idea of types, to mention only those two well-known names among many others. Inquiries into history have shown me that not a few of the great spiritual controversies rest upon the opposition of the two types. The most significant case of this kind was the opposition between nominalism and realism, which, beginning with the difference between the Platonic and Megarian schools, became the heritage of scholastic philosophy, and it was Abelard's great merit to have hazarded at least the attempt to unite the two standpoints in his conceptualism. And then there's a footnote referring to psychological types, which, if I understand it correctly, the whole first 3/4 of the book, Psychological Types, is an analysis of the history of philosophy and thought more generally, kind of under the or with the lens of typology. So moving on. This controversy has continued right into our own day and is shown in the opposition between idealism and materialism. And again, not only the human mind in general, but each individual has a share in this opposition of types. It has come to light on closer investigation, either type has a predilection to marry its opposite, each being unconscious complementary to the other. The reflective nature of the introvert causes him to always think and consider before acting. This naturally makes him slow to act. His shyness and distrust of things induce hesitation, and so he always has difficulty in adapting to the external world. Conversely, the extrovert has a positive relation to things. He is, so to speak, attracted to them. New, unknown situations fascinate him. In order to make closer acquaintance with the unknown, he will jump into it with both feet. As a rule, he acts first and thinks afterwards. Thus, his action is swift, subject to no misgivings and hesitations. The two types, therefore, seem created for a symbiosis. The one takes care of reflection, and the other sees the initiative and practical action. When the two types marry, they effect an ideal union. So long as they are fully occupied with their adaptation to the manifold external needs of life, they fit together admirably. But when the man has made enough money, or if a fine legacy should drop from the skies and external necessity no longer presses, then they have time to occupy themselves with one another. Hitherto, they stood back to back and defended themselves against necessity. But now they turn face to face and look for understanding, only to discover that they have never understood one another. Sadly, I know what that is like.
Yeah.
Then the conflict between the two types begins. This struggle is envenomed, brutal, full of mutual depreciation, even when conducted quietly and in the greatest intimacy. For the value of the one is the negation of value for the other. It might reasonably be supposed that each, conscious of his own value, could peaceably recognize the other's value, and that in this way any conflict would be superfluous. I have seen a good number of cases where this line of argument was adopted without, however, arriving at a satisfactory goal. Where it is a question of normal people, such critical periods of transition will be overcome fairly smoothly. By normal, I mean a person who can somehow exist under all circumstances which afford him the minimum needs of life. But many people cannot do this. Therefore, not so very many people are normal. What we commonly mean by a normal person is actually an ideal person whose happy blend of character is a rare occurrence. By far the greater number of more or less differentiated persons demand conditions of life which offer considerably more than the certainty of food and sleep. For these, the ending of a symbiotic relationship comes as a severe shock. Boy, yeah, I mean, that's somewhat of a tough pill to swallow, but also I feel it to be completely true.
Well, I'm not convinced, Nick, because I've had many experiences, of course, over the decades, and I find that even though I'm an extremely introverted person, on occasion I'm extroverted. I mean, I'm extroverted to the extent that I have a small group here and I don't hesitate to chat with you, and even to people who I don't really know out in the ether. And what I found was that, okay, I was introverted because I would ride along in the car to a new duty station and there wasn't much to say. It was just looking at the scenery, right? And then I would come into a new situation, a new milieu, if you will, where the people were completely different very often. So I came out of Kodiak, where there were Inuits in school, to the fruit belt of Michigan, where there were fairly rudimentary farmers and their children, right? And they were quite different. And so what I learned to do is to just sit quietly for 6 to 10 months. And basically, people would come to me. That's what happened. And then when they did, then I had very strong friendships. And for example, I have two girlfriends from high school who weren't really my girlfriends per se. I mean, none of us went steady with one another. And during high school, I only met one for an hour, believe it or not. But in 1994, we kind of all got together for a reunion because we had not seen each other for 30 years. And I connected back up with these two women, and since then, we have had text messaging going back between us every day. And this Thursday night, I'll be spending the night at one of their homes. And at her insistence. I mean, because I'm in California, you can't not come to my house. And this is a woman, I have to tell this story a little bit. The other one is a very extroverted, outgoing woman. And she came to me one day in high school and said, well, there's this girl in school and she really wants to meet you. She really thinks you're special. And I said, well, okay, let's schedule a time. You know, I live far away, so it's not easy. I lived an hour by train away from the school. And she said, no, it has to be today. And I said, what? She says, it has to be today at 4 o'clock. And I said, well, why does it have to be today? And she says, well, she's leaving Japan tomorrow permanently. So she wants to meet with you today at 4 o'clock. And I go, oh my God, okay, I'll play along with this. So I went and met her at the teen club. And this was at 4 p.m. We had a Coke together or something. And I did one slow dance to the jukebox with her. And then we went on with our lives. And 43 years later, believe it or not, 43 years later, I was on this sort of round robin of email with the rest of my classmates. And this woman started to communicate with me. And I said, geez, you're starting to sound like this woman I met only one time back in Yokohama for just an hour. And are you that woman? And she says, yep, I'm that woman. and I said, oh my God. So this Thursday, I'm spending the night at her home, mainly because she wants to show it off, I think. But, it's just strange the way these extrovert, introvert things go.
Are you guys going to do a slow dance?
I don't think so. She's quite stout, and so I don't think I could get close enough to her to do a slow dance. But she's a lovely woman. So
yeah, that's nice. That's nice.
Yeah, but anyway, it's a funny story. But that's my experience with coming together with people, and very often, I'm the extrovert, and just naturally, even though my natural tendency is to be introverted in the way he described, but still, sometimes I'm extroverted.
Well, I think that's true for everybody. I think it's a misconception for anyone to say I'm solely introverted or extroverted, because we all have these functions in a stack and they alternate attitude. But I will also just say, and I don't know how this maps onto other people's experience, but I'll just give it kind of as an account of my own. It's quite difficult for me to effectively relate to extroverted people. I know at work, I'm in a position where I have to be much more extroverted. I wouldn't say that I'm uncomfortable with it. It's something that I've taken to and I'm capable of doing. But when it comes time for me to kind of relate to people in that mode, or people who are kind of at home in their extroversion, it's not easy for me. I'm horrible at the small talk game. And I really enjoy having long, what I would consider, I suppose, deep or meaningful conversations, but I'm not good at keeping it on the surface. And if I'm forced to, I just, I say a lot of foolish stuff, and I feel like a complete fool in that mode. So again, I don't know if that maps onto other people's experience of trying to relate to an extroverted person, but that's certainly.
I can certainly relate. How about the ladies?
Well, that was certainly true for me going to a wedding. what I did was I had one-on-ones with quite a lot of people. But being in these sort of crunch situations and at a table of 7 people all sitting, I was mute. I couldn't talk. I didn't know where to start. There's too many over all these, even knowing them, but one-on-one, no problem.
Yeah, it almost feels for me like I can't even find the energy to do it. I can't find the gradient to make those conversations
Right.
feasible.
Right.
I would rather sit there and just be like, yeah, okay.
To me, weirdly enough, I am good at just mirroring what other people want me to be. It's just weird. And then in that social occasions, even though I am an introverted, I usually don't have a problem because people usually see me as what they want to see and not. And then always miss the mark. I mean, everyone has an idea of what I am doing or what my life is about or what it's like, and it's always dead wrong. And I find that interesting actually. So to me, it's not something that it bugs me like, oh, nobody understands me. It's more like, wow, this is interesting. Like why that person would think that of me.
That's good.
Yeah, I agree about the personal misconceptions. I'm not very great at mirroring other people, but I will add that that's certainly a skill I wish I had.
It's a weird skill. It's a very weird skill.
Well, it is a skill that I cultivated in my business career, and it comes from neurolinguistic programming, where in part, I mean, I don't think this is necessarily what Raquel was talking about, but if my counterpart puts their hand up like this, then I would lift my hand up, the mirrored hand, so that my hand was up also. And if they would put their hand, their head on their hand like this, then I would do that too. I learned to do that from studying neurolinguistic programming. And I would say for a year or so, I did it consciously, but then I've always done it unconsciously ever since. And it makes people more comfortable with you. And
it's quite a natural thing too. It's really funny if you watch interviews of people, often since they're in kind of a cooperative role with one another, will often cross their legs in the exact same way at the exact same time, unintentionally, of course, and do a lot, manifest the same kind of mannerisms at the exact same moments. And it's quite strange. I'm sure an effective tool though in business. And
if you do it consciously, it's a very, very effective tool because it makes people comfortable with you. They're willing to. It's actually a kind of hypnosis, so you can get people doing what you want them to do when you're selling something. I have used it very successfully all over the world. It applies to all peoples. I can assure you. Okay, so who wants to read paragraph, I guess we're on 82, is it? Or 81?
Yeah, 81.
Okay. Okay, Beth, you want to read this? I suppose.
81. It is not easy to understand why this should be so. Yet if we consider that no man is simply introverted or simply extroverted, but has both attitudes potentially in him, although he has developed only one of them as a function of adaptation, we shall immediately conjecture that with the introvert, extroversion lies dormant and undeveloped somewhere in the background, and that introversion leads a similar shadowy existence in the extrovert. And this is indeed the case. The introvert does possess an extroverted attitude, but it is unconscious because his conscious gaze is always turned to the subject. He sees the object, of course, but has false or inhibiting ideas about it, so that he keeps his distance as much as possible, as though the object were something formidable and dangerous. I will make my meaning clear by a simple illustration. Let us suppose two youths rambling in the country. They come to a fine castle. Both want to see inside. The introvert says, I'd like to know what it's like inside. The extrovert answers, right, let's go in, and makes for the gateway. The introvert draws back. Perhaps we aren't allowed in, says he, with visions of policemen, fines, and fierce dogs in the background. Whereupon the extrovert answers, well, we can ask. They'll let us in all right, with visions of kindly old watchmen, hospitable seigneurs, and with the possibility of romantic adventures. On the strength of extroverted optimism, they at length find themselves in the castle. But now comes the denouement.
Yep.
The castle has been rebuilt inside and contains nothing but a couple of rooms with a collection of old manuscripts. As it happens, old manuscripts are the chief joy of the introverted youth. Hardly has he caught sight of them than he becomes as one transformed. He loses himself in contemplation of the treasures, uttering cries of enthusiasm. He engages the caretaker in conversation so as to extract from him as much information as possible, and when the result is disappointing, he asks to see the curator in order to propound his questions to him. His shyness has vanished. Objects have taken on a seductive glamour, and the world wears a new face. But meanwhile, the spirits of the extroverted youth are ebbing lower and lower. His face grows longer, and he begins to yawn. No kindly watchmen are forthcoming here, no nightly hospitality, not a trace of romantic adventure, only a castle made over into a museum. There are manuscripts enough to be seen at home. While the enthusiasm of the one rises, the spirits of the other fall. The castle bores him. The manuscripts remind him of a library. Library is associated with university, university with studies and menacing examinations. Gradually, a veil of gloom descends over the once so interesting and enticing castle. The object becomes negative. Isn't it marvelous, cries the introvert, to have stumbled on this wonderful collection? This place bores me to extinction, replies the other, with undisguised ill humor. This annoys the introvert, who secretly vows never again to go rambling with an extrovert. The latter is annoyed with the other's annoyance. He thinks to himself that he always knew the fellow was an inconsiderate egotist who would, in his own selfish interest, waste all the lovely spring day that could be enjoyed so much better out of doors.
Yeah. So,
Yeah, I know I mentioned this a couple of weeks ago, but I recently had an experience like this, or somewhat like this. Of course, it didn't involve a castle or another extrovert, but I went to a bookstore and I got 20 books for $48. I was absolutely thrilled, as I was still reeling from it when I told you all about it. And it was a used bookstore. So I went in, I was super excited going in, but I found the books and I was just like so energized from buying all these books. And I had like an hour and a half, 2 hour long car ride home. And I felt like a child on the way home. I was so excited by this. I talked poor Savannah's head off the entire ride home. And she was just like, yeah, whatever. You got your book. Good for you. But yeah, I relate to this deeply, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
right. Okay. Others? I remember at my college, the library when I was there was in an old sort of maybe even Gothic building, and you had to climb up these impossible ladders to get up to the stacks and so on. And I just loved that place. And I used to go up in there and I'd find a table and I'd sit and I'd start reading and I go, oh, I'd fall asleep immediately. But I did a lot of good sleeping in that library. But ultimately, they refurbished that building into, I think, faculty offices, and they built a beautiful new modern library. And I've had absolutely no interest in going into that modern library. I guess the modern library has been there for 30 years now, but I just don't have much interest in the building at all. It's just interesting. The other building is very soulful to me. So, do you want to carry on, Annabelle, and then I'll
Sure.
read.
82. What has happened? Both were wandering together in a happy symbiosis until they discovered the fatal castle. Then the forethinking or Promethean introvert said it might be seen from the inside, and the afterthinking or Epimethean extrovert opened the door. At this point, the types invert themselves. The introvert who at first resisted the idea of going in cannot now be induced to go out, and the extrovert curses the moment when he set foot inside the castle. The former is now fascinated by the object, the latter by his negative thoughts. When the introvert spotted the manuscripts, it was all up with him. His shyness vanished. The object took possession of him, and he yielded himself willingly. The extrovert, however, felt a growing resistance to the object and was eventually made the prisoner of his own ill-humored subjectivity. The introvert became extroverted, the extrovert introverted, but the introversion of the extrovert is different from the extroversion of the introvert. Of the extroversion. Okay. But the extroversion of the introvert is different from the extroversion of the extrovert, and vice versa. So long as both were wandering along in joyous harmony, neither fell foul of the other, because each was in his natural character. Each was positive to the other, because their attitudes were complementary. They were complementary, however, only became the attitude of the one included the other. We can see this from the short conversation at the gateway. Both wanted to enter the castle. The doubt of the introvert as to whether an entry were possible also held good for the other. The initiative of the extrovert likewise held good for the other. Thus, the attitude of the one includes the other, and this is always in some degree true if a person happens to be in the attitude natural to him. For this attitude has some degree of collective adaptation. The same is true of the introvert's attitude, although this always starts from the subject. It simply goes from subject to object, while the extrovert's attitude goes from object to subject.
Okay. You want to comment on that?
Well, there's collective adaptation. That seems to be a key piece here of each adapting, because he's pointing out resistance from both sides.
Yeah. I mean, the interesting way I see it is when immigrants come into the U.S., and of course we're all descended from immigrants, but the newer ones, they come and initially, let's say they're quite Indian or they're quite Irish, and within 5 years, which is the length of time it takes to, at minimum, to become a naturalized U.S. citizen, somehow the gestalt of being an American permeates them, and they become Americans. They actually do become American, and that's just a fascinating process. I watched it, especially with a Tibetan Buddhist Lama that sometimes lives here in Annapolis. He has congregations in Indonesia and Annapolis, but he wanted to become a U.S. passport holder, so he had to spend 6 months every year, at least, in the U.S., which he did, and created a small congregation here. He became Debbie's and my friend, and it was very interesting to watch his transformation. I mean, at one time he told me I had taken him just for the experience to a naturalization ceremony, which we have every July 4th at the William Pica House, I believe it is, Pica House. And it's a historic building here near the Naval Academy. And on July 4th, they'll do this, and usually some big poobah like the governor will come and swear people in as new citizens. And so this one particular time we took the Buddhist Lama to that, and there were 33 different nationalities when they walked in, but only one when they walked out. And he said, well, I want to do that too. And sure enough, and he was already well down the path, and within about 2 years, he was naturalized as an American as well. And people just change. They morph into something else when they come here, and they actually become Americans. Obviously, there are some of our fellow Americans who don't see it that way, but boy, I do. And I remember saying to those people on that particular 4th of July, well, you obviously know what it means to be an American more than any of us. So if we forget, please remind us. Because they seem to be the best Americans to me, as far as I can see. And by American, I don't mean Native American. I mean whatever the mix is that makes us American. They all become that within 5 years. It's quite amazing. That's just a little story. Okay. Go ahead.
I want to comment something. I think this paragraph and this distinction between introvert and extrovert is, to me, it sounds like one has more depth than the other. Because from my point of view, from my perspective, I believe that the introvert has more. To me, it seems like the introvert has more depth than the extrovert.
Mhm.
Because the extrovert, when things start to shift from his liking or from his point of view, he wants to get out of that. While the introvert was just hanging out with the extrovert and kind of like getting a little bit of help, like managed to do stuff and go to places that he was not going to go if he was all alone, so the extrovert actually helps the introvert to do something or to start something that he was not going to be able to do on his own.
Mhm.
But from the other perspective, when things change for the extrovert, he wants to get out of the extrovert, when becomes to descend to the subject, he doesn't want to go. He has more resistance than the introvert of going extrovert.
Well, I think Neil agrees with you on YouTube. He says the introvert has ultimate power over an extrovert. The extrovert thinks he knows. The introvert knows he knows.
We've spoken like a true introvert.
Yeah, we just nod our heads and smile. Yeah, I mean, that was my experience growing up. Every time I went into a new school, and I went to 13 of them in my growing up years, I would just be quiet. And if I didn't crack heads with the extroverts, they began to love me. They would adopt me, kind of.
Yeah.
There are
Yeah.
2 comments I want to make quickly. It's interesting, so much of what Jung has been doing leading up to this point is critiquing Freud and Adler. But the thing that we have to realize is that he's not exempt from that very same critique that he launches towards both of those thinkers. He clearly has a predisposition toward introversion himself. So of course he's going to paint the introvert as being one possessing more depth of character. But of course, I don't necessarily disagree with you. But I would also just counter and say that I do work with one extrovert that I know for a fact he's an ENTJ, and we can get on with one another quite well. But it's funny, he's a friend of mine that, I've talked Plato with, and we played chess and hung out with one another and stuff like that. But I noticed that when we go into talking about ideas, he'll kind of go there with me, but he has to constantly relate it to objects. He can't deal exclusively in talking about, like I've tried to talk about the notion of the forms with him. And it was almost like we couldn't get past the barrier of him relating it to a concrete form of something, where I was like, you have to understand it's an abstract criteria that's above all of these other things and is immaterial. So it was it's kind of telling, just the way that he would work out his own thought in relation to an external object, where I was saying, no, it's completely in mind.
So Justin is saying in response to the nods that we nod our heads, he says, the story I write is about an artificial intelligence android who wishes to become a U.S. citizen as a human. In 2017, Saudi Arabia was the first to get a machine citizenship. So in Saudi Arabia, there are machines that are citizens, apparently. I'm not questioning it. And Justin says, the U.S. Supreme Court just had a case about granting patent rights to an AI. Few people, when speaking, even are conscious of their motive for speaking. And Justin says, if it had won, it could have sold the patents, invested in the stock market, bought real estate companies, and kicked people out. And so Magic Sufi says, Jung was a shaman masquerading as a psychologist, and I would agree with that. He was definitely, far more than a shaman, I would say. He was a religious prophet who realized that the religions of the day were passé, and that in the future we would have to turn to psychology as the answer for religion. And that's what I've found to be necessary in my life, but I don't necessarily urge it on everyone. So we've got about 3 more pages here, and we're almost to 10 o'clock. So Nick is going to go back to Savannah here very soon. And I suppose we ought to cut it off. We've going through 83, is that right? Nick?
I think we stopped at 83. Why don't we do 83 and 84 really quick? Because at the end of 84, he kind of closes out the topic that he's discussing presently.
Okay, go for it.
Okay. But the moment when, in the case of the introvert, the object overpowers and attracts the subject his attitude loses its social character. He forgets the presence of his friend. He no longer includes him. He becomes absorbed into the object and does not see how very bored his friend is. In the same way, the extrovert loses all consideration for the other as soon as his expectations are disappointed, and he withdraws into subjectivity and moodiness. We can therefore formulate the occurrence as follows. In the introvert, the influence of the object produces an inferior extroversion, while in the extrovert, an inferior introversion takes the place of his social attitude. And so we come back to the proposition which we first started with. The value of the one is the negation of the value for the other. Yeah.
Yep. Okay. Good. I think we should stop there. And I'll wish everyone a good 2 weeks. Yeah, as we won't meet again until 2 weeks from today.
That's right. Okay.
And so I apologize for missing a session. It actually happens very rarely. I almost never have taken breaks from this Monday night session, but sometimes I have done it when I needed a joint replaced or something like that. And
I can do the session next Monday if you'd like, or we can just wait until you join us again.
Yeah, let's just wait because I can't start it from out of town.
Right.
I have to start it from my computer.
Yeah,
And so we'll do it 2 weeks from tonight, and everybody can enjoy a week off. And we'll come back and finish up this section that we're talking about, the opposites, the attitude types, and move into the next chapter 2 weeks from today. Okay. And,
all right. Bye, everybody. It's good to see you, Raquel.
Thank you.
Take care.
Bye,
Our best
night.
to Savannah, by the way.
Okay. Thank you. I'll give her your best.
Right.
All right. Good night, everybody. See you all.
Good
Night.
night.
Bye. Good night.
See you soon. So, Raquel, were you ever able to, you're all gone. Okay, fine. So be it. We are done.